June 6, 1944, Normandy, France, 2:30 in the morning. Private First Class Robert Murphy crouches in a drainage ditch, water seeping through his boots, his paratrooper uniform torn from crashing through a tree canopy he couldn't see in the darkness. He's been on French soil for less than an hour and he has no idea where he is. The aircraft that carried him across the English Channel took anti-aircraft fire over the drop zone, and he jumped early, or late, or exactly on time into the wrong place. In the absolute blackness of the Norman countryside, with clouds obscuring even starlight, he might be 100 yards from his unit or 10 miles. He doesn't know. What he does know is that someone is moving through the hedgerow 15 feet away. He can hear boots squelching in mud, equipment rattling softly, labored breathing. Friend or enemy? American paratrooper or German soldier? His entire future compresses into this single moment, this one decision. Murphy's right hand closes around a small metal device in his pocket. It's roughly the size of a button, stamped from cheap tin, the kind of toy you'd find at a 5-and-dime store for 10 cents. A child's cricket clicker. One piece of bent metal inside another, designed to make a sharp clicking sound when you press it. His fingers are slick with sweat despite the cold. If he clicks this cricket and the person moving toward him is German, he's dead. The sound will pinpoint his location. But if he doesn't click, and that's an American searching for his unit, Murphy might shoot a friend. Or that friend might shoot him first. He presses the cricket once. Click, clack. The sound seems impossibly loud in the darkness, a mechanical snap that he's certain every German soldier in France must have heard. He waits. 2 seconds. 3. An eternity compressed into heartbeats. Then, from the darkness, click, clack, click, clack. 2 responses. Murphy's exhale is almost a sob. American, friendly, brother. The Allied invasion of Europe, the largest amphibious assault in human history, the operation that would determine whether Nazi Germany would be defeated or would consolidate control over an entire continent, depended on a million factors: naval bombardment, air superiority, the courage of men running into machine gun fire on blood-soaked beaches. But it also depended on something nobody expected, something so small and unlikely that it sounds like fiction. It depended on toy crickets, thousands of them, distributed to paratroopers who would need to identify each other in absolute darkness while surrounded by enemy forces. This is the story of how a children's plaything became a weapon of war, and how the simple sound of click-clack meant the difference between living and dying on the night that changed the world. To understand why American soldiers were carrying toys into the most important battle of the 20th century, you need to understand the impossible problem facing Allied planners in the months before D-Day. The invasion strategy called for 2 American airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, to parachute behind German coastal defenses hours before the beach landings began at dawn. These paratroopers, roughly 13,000 men, would drop in darkness to secure critical bridges, destroy German artillery positions, and create chaos in the enemy rear. They would prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches, where tens of thousands of soldiers would be landing at first light. The success of the entire invasion and the lives of everyone landing on those beaches would depend partially on what these paratroopers could accomplish in the dark. But the planners knew the drops would be scattered. Pilots flying through anti-aircraft fire and thick clouds at night wouldn't be able to maintain tight formations. Paratroopers would be spread across miles of unfamiliar countryside. Units would be fragmented, soldiers separated from their squads and officers. In darkness so complete, you literally could not see your hand in front of your face. How would these men find each other? How would they consolidate into effective fighting units capable of accomplishing their missions? Verbal passwords were standard, of course, a challenge word and a response, but shouting passwords in the darkness would alert every German soldier in the area to your position. And in the chaos and confusion of combat, with adrenaline pounding, with the deafening noise of artillery and gunfire, verbal challenges often went unheard or were misunderstood. Americans had shot Americans before in night operations, tragic accidents born of fear and confusion in the dark. Someone in the planning staff, and history doesn't record exactly who, suggested the cricket, a simple mechanical noisemaker that could be heard clearly but didn't carry as far as a human voice. One click as a challenge, two clicks as a response. Distinctive, unmistakable, and silent to anyone more than 20 or 30 yards away. The military purchased thousands of these toys, probably from the Acme Toy Company. The records are unclear. Each paratrooper received one before boarding the aircraft that would carry them to Normandy. They were instructed to keep the cricket accessible, probably in a pocket, and to practice the system until it became instinctive. One click, wait for two clicks back. If you heard one click, you responded with two. Simple enough that it could be executed under extreme stress in absolute darkness. Elegance in its simplicity. But simple isn't the same as easy, and a system that works perfectly in training can fall completely apart in the reality of combat. The aircraft carrying the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions crossed the English Channel in long formations, more than 800 planes droning through the darkness toward the Normandy coast. Most of the paratroopers had never been in combat before. They were kids, really, 18, 19, 20 years old. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, and college students who'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor. They'd trained hard, trained until the physical tasks of soldiering became automatic, but nothing could truly prepare them for what was coming. The German anti-aircraft fire started before they reached the coast, tracers arcing up into the darkness, explosions that rocked the aircraft, shrapnel punching holes in aluminum skin. Planes caught fire and spiraled down. Others took evasive action, breaking formation. Pilots desperate to get their cargo of men over the drop zones before the aircraft became flying coffins. The carefully planned drop pattern disintegrated into chaos. Paratroopers jumped into darkness and clouds, falling through anti-aircraft fire, unable to see the ground rushing up to meet them.
Private Jake Thornton from the 101st landed in a tree. His parachute snagged in the branches, and he hung suspended 15 feet above the ground, swaying in the pre-dawn darkness. He could hear gunfire in the distance, shouts in a language that might have been German or French. He activated the quick release on his harness and dropped, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of him. Thornton lay there for 30 seconds, gasping, taking inventory. Nothing broken. His rifle had torn free during the descent, gone. He had his pistol, grenades, a knife, and the cricket in his right breast pocket. That was it. He had no idea where he was. The briefing maps meant nothing now. He knew he was somewhere in Normandy, somewhere behind the Atlantic Wall, somewhere in German-occupied territory. That narrowed it down to approximately hundreds of square miles. He needed to find Americans, needed to link up with anyone from his unit or any unit. Alone, he was just a target waiting to be found. Thornton began moving through the Norman landscape, and that landscape was unlike anything he'd trained for in England or the United States. The French hedgerows were ancient, some of them dating back centuries. Thick earthen banks topped with dense walls of vegetation, some 12 feet high, created a maze of small, irregular fields. Each field was essentially a separate room, with limited visibility and fewer exits. The hedgerows provided perfect cover for defenders and turned the countryside into a nightmare for anyone trying to move or navigate. You could be 5 feet from someone and never know they were there. He walked for 10 minutes, moving slowly, stopping frequently to listen. Every sound could mean danger. The rustle of vegetation could be wind or could be a soldier. The snap of a twig could be an animal or could be a boot coming down. His hand kept returning to the cricket in his pocket, touching it, confirming it was still there. But he didn't use it. Not yet. Using it meant revealing his position, and he wasn't ready to take that gamble. Then he heard it. Click-clack. A single cricket call, somewhere ahead and to his left. Maybe 20 yards away, maybe less. Someone else was out here. someone else with a cricket, someone who is either an American paratrooper or a German who'd figured out the system. Thornton's heart hammered so hard he was certain whoever was out there could hear it. This was the moment. This was the decision. He could respond with 2 clicks, following the protocol, trusting the system, or he could stay silent, bypass this encounter, keep moving alone through enemy territory. Both options could get him killed. He pulled out his cricket, pressed it twice. Click-clack, click-clack. The response came immediately. Flash! The verbal challenge shouted in clear American English. Relief flooded through Thornton. Thunder, he called back, giving the correct response. Within seconds, they'd found each other in the darkness. Another private from the 101st, name of Coleman, also separated from his unit, also carrying only his sidearm and crickets and grenades. They stood there for a moment, 2 kids from different states who'd never met before, grinning at each other in darkness so complete they could barely make out each other's faces. "Best sound I ever heard," Coleman said, holding up his cricket. "Thought I was the only American in France for a while there." They moved together through the hedgerows, 2 men now instead of 1, marginally better odds. Over the next hour, they collected more scattered paratroopers, using the cricket system to find each other in the maze-like terrain. Each encounter followed the same pattern. Movement detected, the tension-filled decision to click or not to click, the challenge sound, the response, the identification, the relief. Sometimes they use verbal passwords as well, doubling up on the identification system. But the cricket always came first, a way of saying, "I'm here, I'm American, don't shoot me," without giving away your position to every German soldier within earshot. By 4 in the morning, Thornton's group had grown to 8 men. Still not a full squad, still missing officers, still unsure of their exact location, but no longer alone. They'd become a functioning unit, capable of fighting, capable of accomplishing something beyond simple survival. They linked up with a lieutenant from the 82nd who'd gathered about 15 men. The lieutenant had a map and a compass and a mission. They were supposed to secure a crossroads 3 kilometers away, an intersection the German reinforcements would need to use to reach the invasion beaches. The Germans couldn't be allowed to hold that crossroads when dawn came. The cricket had turned scattered individuals into a fighting force. That transformation was happening simultaneously all across the Normandy countryside. Hundreds of small groups forming in the darkness, guided together by the distinctive click-clack of toy crickets. Not everyone was so lucky. Sergeant Bill Hayes landed in a flooded field, one of the areas the Germans had deliberately inundated to make the terrain impassable. He hit the water hard, parachute collapsing over him, the weight of his equipment pulling him down. He struggled to the surface, gasping, weighed down by wet gear, standing in water up to his chest. He struggled toward the nearest dry ground, a hedgerow bank that rose above the flood, hauling himself out of the water and collapsing on solid earth. When he checked his pockets, the cricket was gone, lost in the water, fallen out during his struggle to avoid drowning, somewhere at the bottom of the flooded field. It didn't matter where, it was gone. Hayes spent the next 3 hours moving through the darkness without the identification device. He heard cricket calls around him, Americans searching for other Americans, but he couldn't respond correctly. He tried clicking his tongue, tried snapping his fingers, tried to replicate the sound, but it wasn't the same. The cricket had a distinctive metallic quality that couldn't be faked. Without it, he was cut off from the identification system, unable to safely approach other paratroopers or signal his presence. Twice he tried verbal challenges, calling out the password from concealment. The first time there was no response. The second time someone shot at the sound, bullets cracking through the darkness, and Hayes dove into a ditch and stayed there for 20 minutes, certain he'd been shot at by jumpy Americans who'd heard his voice but couldn't verify his identity. When dawn finally broke, Hayes was still alone. He could see other paratroopers moving in the distance, and he approached them carefully, hands visible, shouting identification, hoping nobody's finger was too quick on the trigger.
His experience wasn't unique. Dozens, maybe hundreds of paratroopers lost their crickets during the jump or in the chaos after landing. Some fell out of pockets during the violent parachute deployment. Some were lost when men crashed through trees or landed in water or hit the ground so hard their equipment scattered. Without the cricket, these soldiers were effectively deaf and mute in the identification system, cut off from their units by the simple absence of a small metal device. And then there was the darker possibility. the nightmare scenario that haunted everyone using the cricket system. What if the Germans figured it out? The identification system's security depended on the Germans not knowing about it or not being able to replicate it. But the crickets were mass-produced toys, not sophisticated encrypted devices. If a German soldier found one on a dead or captured American, if they observed the pattern of challenge and response, they could potentially exploit the system. A German who knew to click once and listen for 2 clicks could identify American positions. Or worse, a German with a cricket could potentially infiltrate American groups, getting close before opening fire. Intelligence reports were unclear about whether German forces actually figured out the cricket system during the first night of the invasion. Some accounts suggest that certain German units, particularly the more experienced SS troops, became aware of the clicking sounds and tried to use them to locate American paratroopers. Other reports indicate the Germans never understood what the sounds meant and simply found them strange and unnerving, cricket-like noises in the darkness that added to the general confusion. What's certain is that American paratroopers worried about it. Every time you clicked your cricket in the darkness, you had to trust that whoever responded was genuinely American, not a German who'd learned the system. That added another layer of psychological stress to an already terrifying situation. The cricket was supposed to reduce the fear of shooting friendlies, but it couldn't eliminate the fear entirely. It just changed the nature of the calculation. Captain Richard Winters, who would later become famous as one of the heroes of Easy Company, spent that night gathering scattered men from the 101st Airborne. In his later accounts, he described the cricket system as essential but imperfect. It worked brilliantly most of the time, allowing men to identify each other quickly in darkness and move together toward objectives. But Winters also described moments of uncertainty, hearing a click and having to decide whether to respond, whether to trust the system, whether the click came from a friend or an enemy who'd learned the pattern. In one account, Winters described approaching a hedgerow junction and hearing multiple cricket clicks from different directions, creating a confusing echo of challenges and responses. He couldn't tell how many men were there or what units they were from based on sound alone. He had to eventually use verbal challenges to sort out the situation, discovering a mixed group of paratroopers from different companies, all trying to orient themselves using crickets. The system brought them together but couldn't organize them beyond simple identification. The missions those men accomplished during the night and early morning of D-Day were extraordinary. Despite being scattered across Normandy, despite the chaos of the drops, despite facing German forces that included some of the Wehrmacht's best units, the American paratroopers seized or destroyed most of their key objectives. They captured bridges, they cut roads, they destroyed artillery positions. They created enough confusion and disruption in the German rear areas that reinforcements were delayed or misdirected, unable to reach the beaches during the critical first hours when the amphibious landings were most vulnerable. And they did this largely because the cricket system allowed them to consolidate forces in darkness, to turn scattered individuals into cohesive units capable of fighting. Lieutenant Thomas Meehan led one such group. He'd gathered about 30 men from various companies of the 101st Airborne, using crickets to find them in the darkness. His objective was a German artillery battery, positioned to fire on Utah Beach, where the 4th Infantry Division would be landing at dawn. If that artillery remained operational, it would slaughter Americans as they waded ashore, turning the beach into a killing ground. Meehan's Scratch unit moved toward the German position, using the hedgerows for cover, cricket clicks helping them maintain contact as they advanced through the maze-like terrain. They could hear the German soldiers talking, unaware that American paratroopers had infiltrated this close to their position. Meehan positioned his men, planned the assault, and when he gave the signal, they attacked with grenades and rifle fire, swarming the German position before the defenders could effectively respond. The fight was brief and brutal. The Germans resisted, but they were surprised and outnumbered. Meehan's group killed or captured the gun crews and demolished the artillery pieces with thermite grenades, destroying them thoroughly enough that they couldn't be put back into action. By the time the sun rose on Utah Beach, those guns were silent, unable to fire on the men coming ashore. How many lives did that save? Dozens? Hundreds? There's no way to calculate precisely, but every artillery piece that wasn't firing on the beaches meant more Americans survived to push inland. And Meehan's group existed only because the cricket system allowed him to gather men in the darkness. Without those crickets, those 30 paratroopers might have spent the night as isolated individuals, unable to find each other, unable to mass enough force to assault a defended position. The artillery would have remained operational. The beach landings would have been bloodier. This pattern repeated across Normandy. Small groups of paratroopers assembled through cricket clicks in the darkness, punching above their weight and accomplishing missions that affected the entire invasion. Not every mission succeeded, not every group survived, but enough did to matter, to make a difference, to tip the balance in crucial moments. As dawn broke on June 6th, the situation began to clarify. Daylight revealed positions, allowed visual identification, made the cricket system less necessary. But it also revealed the cost. The fields and hedgerows of Normandy were littered with the evidence of the night's fighting: crashed gliders, burnt equipment, bodies in both American and German uniforms. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had accomplished most of their objectives, but at significant cost. Hundreds of paratroopers were dead. Hundreds more were wounded or missing. Some had drowned in flooded fields. Some had been killed by anti-aircraft fire before they even left the planes. Some had landed in German strongpoints and been killed or captured before they could organize.
The paratroopers who survived that first night remembered the crickets. In memoirs and interviews conducted decades later, veterans would describe the sound of the cricket as one of their most vivid memories of D-Day. Some kept their crickets for the rest of their lives, carrying them home as personal talismans, small pieces of metal that represented survival and brotherhood. Museums now hold dozens of these crickets, donated by veterans or their families. Physical artifacts, mass-produced toys that became instruments of life and death. The sound itself became emotionally charged. Veterans described how hearing a cricket click, even years after the war, could transport them back to the hedgerows of Normandy. At reunions of airborne divisions, someone would occasionally produce a cricket and click it, and the room would go silent. Men in their 70s and 80s would hear that distinctive click-clack and remember being 19 years old, alone in the darkness, surrounded by enemies, hearing that sound and knowing they'd found a friend. There's something profound about the cricket that goes beyond its tactical utility. It represents a particular kind of American military culture, a willingness to embrace unconventional solutions and to trust in simplicity. The German military in 1944 was in many ways more technologically advanced than the American military. German tanks were often better armored and armed. German infantry weapons were frequently more sophisticated. But the Germans wouldn't have distributed toy crickets to their soldiers. It would have seemed beneath the dignity of the Wehrmacht, too crude, too simple, too much like a joke. American planners didn't care about dignity or sophistication. They cared about solving problems. They had a problem. Paratroopers needed to identify each other in darkness without verbal challenges. The solution didn't need to be elegant or high-tech. It needed to work. A 10-cent toy cricket worked. So they bought thousands of them and gave them to elite paratroopers preparing for the most important military operation in history. That practical, problem-solving mindset, that willingness to use whatever works regardless of how it looks or sounds, that's deeply embedded in American military tradition. It shows up again and again throughout history. Duct tape and spare parts keeping vehicles running. Improvised armor welded onto trucks in Iraq. Soldiers in Vietnam using can openers and rubber bands to modify their weapons. The American military at its best has always been an organization that values results over protocol, effectiveness over appearances. The cricket represents that tradition perfectly. It's also a symbol of something else, something harder to articulate but equally important. In war, especially in modern industrial war, individual soldiers can feel like insignificant cogs in an enormous machine. You're one person among millions,
one small part of vast operations planned by generals and politicians, your individual survival or death almost random, determined by factors beyond your control. The cricket restored a measure of individual agency. It was something you controlled, a decision you made, an action you took that directly affected your survival. Pressing that cricket was a choice, an act of trust and faith that you executed yourself. The response you received wasn't random. It was another human being making the same choice, extending the same trust. Every cricket click was a moment of connection between individuals in a situation designed to destroy individuality and reduce men to statistics. It was a way of saying, I'm here, I'm human, I'm on your side, in the middle of industrial-scale slaughter. That matters. That means something beyond the tactical advantages. When military historians analyze D-Day, they talk about grand strategy and logistics, naval forces and air support, beach defenses and casualty rates. These analyses are important and necessary, but they can obscure the ground-level reality, the lived experience of the men who actually fought the battle. For those men, for the paratroopers scattered across Normandy in the darkness of June 6, 1944, the invasion's success didn't depend primarily on strategy or logistics. It depended on immediate, personal decisions, on clicking a cricket or staying silent, on trusting the response or assuming it was a trap, on finding enough friends in the darkness to form a unit capable of fighting. The cricket connected the grand strategy to the individual soldier. It was the physical object that bridged the gap between Eisenhower's planning and Murphy's survival. Both mattered. Neither would have succeeded without the other. By the afternoon of June 6th, the Normandy invasion was clearly succeeding. The beach landings, despite heavy casualties at Omaha Beach, had established firm footholds. Allied forces were pushing inland. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The Germans were unable to mount effective counterattacks to throw the Allies back into the sea. The invasion wouldn't be stopped. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, those who survived the first 24 hours, continued fighting inland. They wouldn't be withdrawn from Normandy for more than a month. They fought through the hedgerows, suffering continuous casualties, taking and holding ground, preventing German forces from organizing effective defenses. The divisions that had scattered so chaotically in the darkness became some of the most effective fighting forces in the European theater. Many of them kept their crickets. Even after daylight made the identification system obsolete, even after they'd pushed far enough inland that the confusion of the initial drop was long past, some paratroopers kept the cricket in their pocket or attached to their gear. It had become more than a tool. It had become a symbol, a reminder, a connection to that first terrible night when everything was chaos and confusion and the only thing you could trust was the sound of a toy cricket in the darkness. Private First Class Robert Murphy, who we met at the beginning of this story crouching in a drainage ditch, survived D-Day. He fought through France and into Holland with the 101st Airborne. He was wounded twice, neither time seriously enough to be evacuated. He made it through the war. When he finally returned home to Pennsylvania in 1945, he brought his cricket with him. He kept it in a drawer in his bedroom for the rest of his life.
His daughter found it after he died in 1998. She had no idea what it was initially, just a small metal toy that clicked when you pressed it. She almost threw it away while cleaning out the house. Then she found her father's war memorabilia, the photographs and medals and letters, and she understood. The cricket went into a shadow box with his jump wings and combat ribbons. It sits there now, in a living room in Pennsylvania, a small piece of stamped tin that once meant the difference between living and dying on the most important night of the 20th century. That's the real story of D-Day's secret weapon. Not that it was technologically sophisticated or strategically brilliant, though it was clever in its way. The real story is that it was human scale, personal, something you could hold in your hand, something that connected you to other people in the darkness when connection meant survival. The sound of a child's toy becoming the sound of hope, of recognition, of brotherhood in the worst circumstances imaginable.
The Allied victory in Europe didn't depend solely on crickets, of course. It required industrial might and strategic bombing and naval supremacy and the courage of millions of soldiers from dozens of nations. It required the sacrifice of Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front and the production capacity of American factories and the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. No single factor determined the outcome. Wars that large and complex don't have single causes or single solutions. But within that vast tapestry of global conflict, in the small tactical space of scattered paratroopers trying to find each other in Norman hedgerows, the cricket mattered enormously. It saved lives. It enabled missions. It turned chaos into something approaching order. And it did so through elegant simplicity, through a solution so straightforward it seems almost absurd in hindsight. A toy cricket, 10 cents at any store in America, the sound of click-clack in the darkness. That's what makes the story resonate. It's human-scale warfare in the age of industrial total war. It's individual agency in a situation designed to obliterate individuality. It's the power of simple solutions to complex problems. It's the way small things can matter enormously when lives are at stake. The men who clicked those crickets in the darkness of Normandy are almost all gone now. Time has done what German bullets couldn't, taking them one by one over the decades since 1944. The youngest of them would be over 100 years old now. Soon there will be no living memory of that night. No one left who remembers what it felt like to press that small piece of metal and wait for the response that meant you weren't alone. But the crickets remain, in museums and private collections, in shadow boxes and display cases, small pieces of stamped tin that once carried the weight of the world. If you visit the Airborne Museum in Normandy, you can see several of them, displayed alongside maps and weapons and photographs. They look insignificant. Toy crickets, the kind of thing a child would play with for an afternoon before forgetting about it. Unless you know the story. Unless you understand what they meant and what they represent. Then they become something else entirely. Then they become artifacts of courage and ingenuity and desperate trust in the darkness. Then they become reminders that war, despite all its industrial horror and strategic complexity, ultimately comes down to individual humans making individual decisions in moments of extreme stress and fear. 1 click. 2 clicks. The simplest possible code. The most important sound those men would ever hear. The difference between friend and enemy, between living and dying, on the night that changed the world. That's the secret weapon. That's what mattered. Not the grand strategy or the massive logistics, though those mattered too. But in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the absolute darkness of early June 6, 1944, what mattered was the click-clack of a 10-cent toy and the trust that someone would answer.